At the beginning, no one realized that the question had already been asked. It did not appear in official speeches, nor in scientific reports, nor in global transmissions. It emerged in a much more discreet way, almost intimate, spread through short conversations, individual decisions, silent withdrawals. The question was no longer how to save the planet. It was another one. Why should we continue here? For a long time, the civilization of Kalior lived without needing to formulate this. Human presence was an implicit given, as natural as the sky or the ground. The planet spun, life prospered, and no one felt the need to justify their own existence upon it. Now that had changed, not because the planet demanded explanations, but because it had stopped accommodating. The accepted regions became increasingly restricted, not by explicit prohibition, but by practical viability. Where the planet cooperated, life continued with minimal effort. Where it resisted, everything demanded too much: energy, maintenance, constant attention. Little by little, civilization realized something uncomfortable. It could only continue to exist where it caused little impact, and that was a problem, because everything that defined it as a civilization came from impact, construction, expansion, transformation of the environment. Reducing that meant reducing its own collective identity. Kalior was not expelling anyone, but it was imposing an implicit condition: if you want to stay, be smaller. This understanding began to generate a silent division, not between nations nor between classes, but between worldviews. Some accepted reduction as necessary evolution. Others felt that it represented the end of something essential, even if they could not name exactly what. The word deserving began to appear in strange contexts. Deserving to remain, deserving to occupy space, deserving to continue existing there. It was a new, uncomfortable language because it displaced the center of the story. For the first time, civilization saw itself not as the planet's natural protagonist, but as a guest under continuous evaluation. And the evaluator did not speak. Scientists tried, once again, to translate planetary behavior into comprehensible models. They no longer spoke of intention, nor of consciousness. They used cold terms: systemic optimization, reduction of unstable variables, prioritization of long-term balance. But outside the laboratories, those words did not help much. What people felt was simpler. The planet no longer needed them. This feeling began to infiltrate culture. Narratives of greatness almost completely disappeared. The idea of building something that lasts forever sounded absurd in a world that clearly preferred less permanence, less rigidity, less mark. The arts reflected this. Stories began to end without climaxes. Music avoided crescendos. Everything seemed to be slowly learning not to take up too much space, as if even imagination were adapting. Meanwhile, a proposal began to circulate among the most influential political centers. It was not a technical project, nor a direct intervention. It was something different, more abstract, and precisely because of that, more dangerous. The proposal to prove worth. The idea was simple on the surface. If the planet seemed to tolerate certain forms of presence more than others, perhaps it would be possible to demonstrate collectively that civilization could exist without representing systemic risk. Not to control, not to correct, but to convince. Not the planet exactly, but the balance it sought. The proposal divided opinions immediately. Some saw it as a desperate attempt to humanize a system that did not operate by moral criteria. Others believed that trying nothing was equivalent to accepting one's own slow extinction. Even so, the plan advanced, not as an immediate global action, but as a distributed experiment. Entire regions volunteered to drastically reduce their footprint. Infrastructure was dismantled, automated systems were shut down, entire cities went through a process of forced simplification. They called it a gesture of compatibility. The goal was not to save the planet. It was to show that civilization could exist without forcing responses. For a time, it seemed to work. The simplified regions showed increasing stability. The environment cooperated. The climate adjusted without resistance. Life continued with less friction than in areas that were still highly structured. The plan's defenders celebrated, but something was wrong. Those regions did not become centers of civilizational rebirth. They did not attract expansion nor innovation. On the contrary, they became pockets of quiet but stagnant survival. It was possible to live there, but it was not possible to grow. The question returned, more uncomfortable than before. If in order to stay, we need to stop being what we are we still staying? Meanwhile, planetary deceleration continued indifferent to human gestures. It neither accelerated nor retreated. The planet did not reward effort nor punish its absence. It simply continued, as if saying, without words, "This is not about you." This realization struck the last ones who still believed in human protagonism. There was no possible negotiation with a system that did not react emotionally nor value intention. Calliord did not want explanations. It did not want requests. It did not want promises. It wanted less impact, and anything beyond that seemed irrelevant. It was at this point that the most radical idea since the collapse of the gravitational anchors emerged, an idea that no one dared to say out loud at first, but that began to appear in private records, secret simulations, restricted conversations. The idea to choose who would continue occupying that space, not as punishment, not as deliberate exclusion, but as logical consequence. Fewer people, fewer cities, less pressure. The idea was terrible precisely because it made sense. And for the first time since the beginning of the entire crisis, the conflict ceased to be between humanity and planet. It became internal to civilization itself. Who would stay? Who would leave? Who would give up? Calliord did not demand this explicitly, but it also did not offer an alternative. And silently, civilization began to understand that perhaps the greatest decision in its history would not be technical nor scientific. It would be moral. The idea of choosing who would stay was not announced. It was normalized. It did not arise as an official plan nor as an explicit proposal. It appeared diluted in technical terms, feasibility reports, demographic projections, always presented as mathematical consequence, never as ethical decision. Reduction of population density, sustainable redistribution, optimization of systemic impact, cold words for an ancient thought. Civilization began to treat its own presence as an adjustable variable, not by declared cruelty, but by silent pragmatism. If the planet offered less space, then fewer people could occupy that space. It was reasoning too simple to be easily refuted. The problem was what came next. Who decides who remains? The question divided entire communities even before being spoken out loud. Some defended technical criteria, environmental impact, energy efficiency, adaptability. Others spoke of lotteries, as if randomness could relieve the moral weight of the choice. There were those who argued that no one should decide, that the planet itself, by making certain regions unviable, was already making the selection on its own. One only needed not to interfere. This position gained strength quickly. It was the most comfortable one, because it did not require direct responsibility. Letting the planet choose seemed fairer than assuming the role of judge. After all, no one was being forcibly expelled. People simply stayed where it was possible to stay. Where it was not, they left. But leave to where? Callior no longer offered infinite frontiers. There were no new continents to conquer, nor untouched regions waiting for colonization. The available space was shrinking, and civilization was beginning to bend to fit into it. Some communities accepted this with disturbing serenity. They adapted to smaller, slower, quieter lives. They abandoned complex technologies, reduced expectations. They called it late harmony. Others resisted, not with open violence, but with insistence. They tried to maintain large projects, old structures, ways of life that demanded more than the planet seemed willing to offer. These attempts did not end in immediate disaster. They ended in exhaustion. Nothing worked for long. Costs accumulated. Small problems multiplied. Energy was never enough. The soil never fully cooperated. It was like trying to keep an old machine running in an environment that no longer accepted its gears. Little by little, even the most resistant grew tired. There was no glory in fighting a world that did not attack. Meanwhile, the discourse of deserving consolidated, not explicitly but implicitly in everyday decisions. Those who lived more simply were seen as more compatible. Those who demanded more resources were considered difficult. These words were never spoken in public, but they guided choices. Culture changed faster than politics. Stories about individual sacrifice in the name of balance began to be valued. The idea of giving up began to be celebrated as virtue, not from pure altruism, but because it seemed to align with what the planet tolerated. Civilization began to redefine itself around the idea of not disturbing, and that had an invisible cost. Creativity diminished, boldness disappeared, the future lost depth. Living became possible, imagining became difficult. Callior continued decelerating, indifferent to these human transformations. The planet neither rewarded virtuous behavior nor punished excesses quickly. It simply maintained its course, as if all this reorganization were irrelevant to its final balance. This indifference was the hardest blow, because it meant that no human explanation mattered. It did not matter how much civilization justified itself, reduced itself, or reorganized itself. The planet was not listening. It was not evaluating intentions. It simply followed the logic of a system that had learned to protect itself. And systems like that do not negotiate. The final proposal emerged when it became clear that the deceleration was no longer reversible. Even without Axis Zero, even without any active interference, Callior would not return to its old rhythm. The planet had found a new state of stability, and that state did not include an expansive civilization. The question ceased to be how to prove that we deserve to stay. It became another: how much of us still fits here? Some argued that civilization should accept its own fragmentation, that small communities could survive for ages, dispersed, discrete, almost invisible to the planet. There would no longer be a center nor a grand collective project, only residual permanence. Others saw in this the true end of civilization, not extinction, but something perhaps worse: the loss of shared meaning. Because civilization is not only surviving, it is remembering, it is planning, it is building something that surpasses one generation. And none of that seemed compatible with a world that preferred less mark, less rigidity, less permanence. Callior no longer needed civilization as an organizing force. The planet was stable without it. And this realization eroded the last human argument. We were not essential. Accepting this idea was not immediate. There was denial, rationalization, late attempts to romanticize reduction. But deep down, everyone felt the same discomfort. Living in a world that doesn't need you changes everything. The relation inverted. Before, the planet was a setting. Now, it was a criterion. And perhaps this was the deepest adjustment of all. The last generation that remembered the world before deceleration began to disappear. With it disappeared also the memory of a planet that responded, that reacted, that allowed itself to be shaped. For the youngers, Callior had always been like this, silent, selective, indifferent. They felt no loss. They simply accepted the world as it was. And this, more than any technical data, confirmed the final truth. The planet did not need to defeat civilization. It just needed to outlast us. Callior continued spinning, slower, safer, more alone. And civilization, now reduced, fragmented, and silent, began to understand that perhaps there would be no last chance to explain itself, because the world had already moved on. If the planet no longer needs explanations, perhaps it no longer needs us. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next episode. Like the video if this story kept echoing after it ended. And watch the continuation, where the question stops being who deserves to stay and becomes what is still worth saving. Because sometimes the end of civilization does not come with destruction. It comes when the world continues, and we need to decide what we are without it.